strange boy looked astonished. "Why don't you fight then?" he asked crossly. "Because if I hit you back, I'd be no better than you are. I'd be just as rotten and worthless, and I'd have no right to be free." The strange boy grinned at him. There was a look of uncertainty about him, and his eyes shifted uneasily. "You're not all there," he said. "Who do you think you're talking to?" "I don't think. I know. I'm talking to someone who likes brute force, and that's why I don't want to talk to you anymore. You can hit me again if you can catch me." With that, David jumped up smartly and ran off. He could not run very quickly because he was beginning to ache all over where the other had struck him. But the strange boy did not follow him. He only shouted, "Idiot! You're a daft coward." David had the impression that he was shouting so loudly for his own benefit. David was sick, and every time he thought about the young stranger, he felt like being sick again. He found it difficult to understand that people should be so much better off here in Italy, where they had so much food to eat and were surrounded by so much beauty, and yet could still love violence. That boy was just like the guards in the camp, the only difference being that the guards did not leave off striking till their victims fainted. The boy, of course, had had only his bare hands to strike with and had tired of the effort too soon. For a moment, David was tempted to think that perhaps there were no good people at all outside concentration camps, but then he reminded himself of the sailor and Angelo and the other people who might have been ignorant but were certainly not bad. And then, when he was living among the rocks overhanging the sea, there had been the man with the loaves. He had not been bad either. He had just not been brave enough to let a boy go without giving him away, not for more than a few days at any rate. Yes, he felt there must be somewhere where everybody was kind and decent, a free country where people did not believe violence was a good thing. And he would find a free country if he could do it before he were caught again. But first of all, he must have a thorough wash. He thought, from the lie of the land, that there was probably a river nearby. There was, a large one too, although it was partly dried up. David took his clothes off and laid them in the water. He scrubbed himself thoroughly all over. His soap would soon be worn thin at that rate, but he didn't care. He must not leave a spot unwashed where the boy had touched him. Not until all contact with him had been washed away would David be able to feel free again. He washed his hair too, and then took his clothes out of the water and laid them out to dry. He lay down beside them and made an effort to calm himself and forget the boy. Much better to recall what the music had sounded like. Had there been a large orchestra inside that fine house, or had it been a radio? He was startled by the sound of voices not far away. He pulled his wet clothes towards him. A large boulder provided good cover on one side, and in front of him the trunk of an olive and rows of close-growing vines, old and gnarled, completely hid him from view when he ducked down. It was the sound of children playing, and David decided he would watch them. He usually hurried away when he saw children. He was afraid of them. He had never spoken to children, and he did not know how to begin. From the very first day, when he had made his home among the rocks, he had made up his mind to avoid children. They were much more dangerous than grown-ups, except them, of course. Grown-ups could not really remember what children were like, so Johanna once said. But other children would very soon discover that he knew nothing of the things they took for granted. One thing alone would give him away. He had no idea how to play. People were always talking about children playing, but playing seemed to mean so many different things that David had given up trying to find out what it was. There were so many more important things to learn about, and as long as he avoided children, there was no need for him to be able to play. But since he could not get away with that before they went, he might just as well watch them. He parted the vines cautiously so that he could see. There were two little boys, much smaller than himself, and a girl who was somewhat bigger, perhaps 10 or even 11, shouting and laughing, and all three talking at once. They were running round a small building, not the sort of place people lived in, but where they kept tools and wheelbarrows and baskets for fruit picking. David could not take his eyes off the girl. She had black curly hair, very long and tied with a red ribbon, and everything about her was so beautiful, not just her fine red dress, but everything. Her laughter sounded like the light tinkling of polished glass, and when she moved, she reminded David of a flower swaying in the wind. They said they were going to play something they called Davy Crockett and the Indians. First, the little boys were going to play at being Indians. They would capture the girl, shut her up in the shed and go off. Then, when they came back, they would pretend to be Davy Crockett and set her free. David thought it sounded silly, but that was probably because he didn't really know what ordinary children were like. The girl had gone into the shed now, and so there was nothing more to watch. He was very tired too, and thought he might just as well take a nap before the little boys returned. Then, perhaps they would go off with the girl, and David could go on his way. David was wakened by shouting and crying, and a strange smell in the air. "She's on fire! She's on fire! It was your fault. Catcher, you thought of it. You know very well we weren't to play with the fire." It was the two little boys, and it was the shed that was on fire. A shed was feminine in Italian. "What shall we do then? Run and get Carlo, Catcher. Oh, if only she doesn't get burnt while you're gone." Both the little boys were crying. One of them set off running in the direction David had come from. The other just stood there and wept. She was burning. The girl. It was not the shed, it was the girl they were talking about. The little girl who looked so like a flower was inside that fire. David sprang up and took a step forward. Then he turned round and, grabbing his clothes, flung them into the river and jumped in after them. They were now sopping wet again. So many thoughts flashed through his mind as he ran that it seemed like hours to David before he reached the shed. A man in the camp had once escaped from a burning building by wrapping wet clothes round his head to keep the smoke out and prevent himself from losing consciousness, and he had not got burnt about the face. If only he could get her out now. The wall was not yet burning so fiercely, but the door was a regular bonfire, and all those dry leaves and stalks the roof was made of, he would have to have her out before the fire got a proper hold. He was just going to call on God to help him when a thought occurred to him. God certainly would not want that little girl, so like a flower and so beautiful to look at, to die. Here then was something he could do for God in return. He could not say it aloud because he was running too hard, and so he said it to himself. "God of the green pastures and running waters, please don't help me. I want to do it by myself so that you'll know I've found something I can do for you. I'm David. Amen." By the time he had reached the burning shed, the little boy who had stayed behind was still crying, and David could hear other voices down by the river, but he had no time to look around. With all the speed he could muster, he undid his bundle and took out his knife, picked up his wet clothes again, and with one hand held his trousers up in front of his nose and mouth. Then he sprang into the blazing fire. The flames had hardly reached the inside, but it was full of smoke. In the middle of the floor sat the little girl tied to an old chair. The tears were streaming from her eyes, and between fits of coughing she was shouting hoarsely for help. David's first impulse was to run straight to her. Then he realised he must stop to consider what to do. He must think quickly, but as carefully as if he had all the time in the world. He must have time to cut through her bonds. The blaze from the door was now beginning to spread rapidly, the flames licking along the floor where the dry leaves lay by the wall. There were no windows in the shed. They would have to get out again through the burning doorway. Near it stood a pile of baskets and boxes which David removed as far away as he could from the door, leaving a train of 3 or 4 pieces of wood behind him. Then he seized a birch broom, already smouldering slightly, and swept all the dry leaves away from the other walls towards the pile of baskets, so that, as he hoped, the fire would be encouraged to burn in that direction instead of filling the whole room at once. In the meantime, he was coughing too. He could not hold his wet clothes up to his face and shift the baskets and sweep the floor as well. Then his attention turned to the girl. "Shut your eyes," he said, "and your mouth." He wound his wet shirt round her face, taking care that she could breathe freely inside. Then he started cutting through her bonds. Luckily, they were only a coarse, loose twine. If they had bound her to the chair, it would have not been so easy. But the knife was not very sharp, and he had to saw backwards and forwards several times, and the little girl was beginning to wriggle her feet. David gripped them firmly to show her she must sit still. He dared not speak and risk getting more smoke inside his lungs, and the heat was quite unbearable, but he was going to do it. He was going to. He must.